Chapter 831. A bodyguard in black heard the commotion and came over. "What's the matter?" The guard replied, "This fella is making a fuss on purpose." Helios remained calm throughout the whole conversation. "I'm not trying to make a fuss. But Ms. Chase is indeed having heartburn now. Are you telling me that Mr. Grant isn't even willing to provide her with medication?" The bodyguard took a glance at Helios, took his cell phone out, and made a call at the side. He then said to the guard, "Go to a nearby pharmacy and get medicine for heartburn. Just satisfy them first whenever they need anything." The guard was dumbfounded. But thinking that he was only working for someone else, he could only obey the instructions. Helios walked over to Barbara's side, squatted down, and helped her up. "Are you all right?" Barbara was in so much pain that she could not sit up straight or speak, and a few droplets of sweat rolled down her pale cheeks. 10 minutes later, the guard brought the medicine back and prepared a bottle of warm water for them. Helios poured a glass of water from the bottle for her and handed a tablet to her. She took the tablet, swallowed it, and drank water. It was still raining outside, and the cold and humid breeze gusted in through the window, making Barbara tremble involuntarily. Helios took off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. She gradually felt warmer after a short while, and her stomach stopped hurting so much. She then asked feebly, "How will you cope with the cold now that you've given me your jacket?" Helios leaned against the wall. "It's okay. I'm not cold." Barbara lowered her gaze. "If I were the only one here, I really don't know how I'd be able to survive this until the moment I get rescued." Jaeger, who had been detained in the Glitz Club for several days, could not stand it any longer. He smashed the wine glass to vent his anger and pointed it at the guards. "You people from the Glitz Club are really doing as you please now, huh? Are you planning to imprison me here till the day I die?" The bodyguards who were guarding him were expressionless and did not respond to his tantrum. Jaeger kicked the table angrily and wandered back and forth in the room with his arms akimbo. He spoke again. "Where's that bitch, Katrina? I want to see her. I've not been allowed to leave the Glitz Club ever since the night Katrina invited me here. That be *TCH, as expected, she's teamed up with these people to set me up." Seeing that the bodyguards did not speak, Jaeger walked up to them and grabbed the hem of the collar of one of the bodyguards. "I'm asking you a question. You're already in your 20s, aren't you, Mr. Zhivkov Jr.? So why are you still acting like a young brat? That's very impulsive of you." Jaeger heard a voice coming from behind and looked at the man who was approaching him, while the bodyguards at the scene bowed respectfully in an instant at the man. "Sir? Sir?" Jaeger released his hand and took a good look at the man. "Are you the owner of Glitz?" The man smiled. "My last name is Summer." He moved past Jaeger, walked up to the couch, and sat down. "I'm keeping you here in the club without any malicious intentions." "There aren't any malicious intentions?" Jaeger approached the man. "Your people confiscated my cell phone and won't let me leave this club at all. This is illegal imprisonment. Your father is missing." Jaeger was astonished. "What do you mean by that?" The man kept a smile on his face. "The police seized the batch of goods that your father shipped the other day." Looking at Jaeger's stiff and stern expression, he twirled the crystal beads with his fingers while giving off an obscure smile. "You should know what kind of fate your father will face." Jaeger did not speak. The man waved, and a bodyguard came over with Jaeger's cell phone. He then handed it back to Jaeger. "I'm keeping you in the club for the sake of your personal safety. However, since you want to leave, I won't insist on keeping you here." Jaeger grabbed his phone, took a glance at the man sitting on the couch, and walked out without looking back. Chapter 832. Jaeger left the Glitz Club but was assaulted and taken away the moment he stepped out of the premises. At Black Gold, Quincy knocked on the door of the office. He then opened the door and walked in after obtaining permission. "Mr. Goldman." "We got him." Nolan closed the documents in his hands. Have him handed over to Mr. Boucher after we've completed the matter. Quincy nodded. When he was about to leave, he remembered something and reported, by the way, Mrs. Goldman has located Maisie Hannigan. And as expected, she should have gone to find her together with Sadie. Nolan frowned. Maisie still did not know the trouble approaching her at this moment. She had been under the impression they could not track her down, so she was never worried. She was walking out of a designer boutique when she felt nauseous all of a sudden. Thus, she dashed to the bathroom and vomited over the sink. She then turned on the tap to flush out the filthy liquid in the sink, took some time to catch a breath, but vomited again immediately after managing to calm herself down. She was on the verge of blacking out after all the vomiting, and her face was ashen. Looking at herself in the mirror, she suddenly remembered something, and her expression changed instantly. It seems that I've missed my period for quite some time. Could it be? At the gynecology department of the hospital. Maisie's hands were trembling when she received the test results. I'm pregnant. But why now? I originally thought that I could blame everything on Francisco if I were to get pregnant around this time. Although Francisco didn't touch me that night, I got it on with someone else the next night. I was betting that I could get pregnant from that one encounter. As long as this plan was a successful one, my plan to get married to the Bouchers will no longer be just wishful thinking. However, I got pregnant now, 2 weeks ahead of schedule. How can I push the blame on the Bouchers now? Maisie hid the pregnancy certificate and went straight to the hotel. She had just stepped through the room entrance when she saw that the room was tidy and remembered that she had left a message, telling the room service crew not to clean the room when she was out. Upon realizing that something was wrong, she was about to turn around and run out of the room. However, Sadie suddenly appeared at the room entrance, blocking her way out. Maisie was about to scream when the dagger in Sadie's hand was placed against her neck. Sadie then pushed Maisie back into the room and closed the door. That was when Maisie came out of the bedroom, leaned against the wall, and looked at Maisie with her arms crossed. Sadie pushed Maisie onto the couch. Maisie glared at Maisie and gnashed her teeth. It's you. You've been enjoying your life to the fullest these days, huh, Miss Hannigan? Maisie walked up to the couch and took the seat opposite Maisie. It seems that you found yourself a new backer as I expected, am I right? Maisie Vanderbilt, what are you trying to do? She was too afraid to move because of the dagger hanging right above her neck. Maisie threw a photo in front of her. Maisie looked at the photo, and the complexion of her cheeks changed slightly. Maisie glanced at her. I heard that you're one of the reasons the shipment was discovered. It's no wonder that we still encountered such an issue even when Nolan had sent Sadie, someone they had never seen before, to handle the deal. Maisie wanted to get up, but Sadie held her shoulders and pressed her against the floor. She struggled twice and said with a vicious scoff, Are you planning to threaten me? Maisie Vanderbilt. I'm betting that you don't have the guts to do anything to me. Maisie squinted her eyes, stared at Maisie for a long time, and chuckled. Did I say I was going to do something to you? That's it, you won't even dare to kill me. Maisie's expression looked arrogant and somewhat presumptuous. Aren't you two here only because you want to extract the whereabouts of the person in the photo out of me? Let me make it clear to you. I won't tell you shit, so what will you do to me? The air in the room became stagnant for a short while. Upon seeing her unwillingness to cooperate, Maisie's smile turned a little more restrained, and she said calmly, But do you know that assisting and covering the mafia's smuggling act is a crime? Maisie was dumbfounded, and she was out of words as if she had lost her voice. Since you don't want to give me that information, I can only hand you over to the police. After all, the police are still investigating the people behind the shipment. If you still choose to harbor them, I can only ask you to come with me. Chapter 833. Maisie roared, Maisie Vanderbilt, I dare you to threaten me again. Maisie still did not change her expression. I've given you a chance to have a friendly conversation with me, but since you don't want to. Upon saying that, she took her cell phone out, dialed 911, and showed Maisie the screen. I'm still waiting to claim the bounty on your head. Stop. Maisie really panicked at that moment. One, of course, know that covering them up is a crime, but I don't want to go to prison. But I don't dare to betray my sugar daddy either. I can't go to the precinct with you. I'm pregnant. Maisie murmured. Maisie scoffed. Why are you telling me that you're pregnant? It's not like I'm the father of the baby. Maisie could not help but clench her hands tightly, trembling from head to toe, and begged, You're also a woman who has children. Don't you think that you're being too cruel to a mother whose child hasn't even been born? Your faulty reasoning doesn't work on me. I'm only giving you 10 minutes. Maisie showed her no mercy. Maisie bit her lip tightly and did not let go. The bite was so deep that she could feel the skin of her lips on the brink of being bitten off. After a long time, Maisie gave in to the threat. Maisie and Sadai left the hotel. And Maisie handed a recording pen to Officer Zaleski at the parking lot. Officer Zaleski took the recorder. Thank you very much for helping us with this, Mrs. Goldman. Maisie smiled and nodded. You're welcome. After Officer Zaleski stepped into the hotel with a few other officers in plain clothes, Maisie turned her head and asked Sadai, Do you think it's despicable of me to betray her? Sadai was caught off guard by the question for a split second and shook her head. No, Maisie smiled and asked, Why so? You didn't tell her that you would let her off. The deal wouldn't have failed if she wasn't there when it was taking place the other day. Maisie returned to the Blue Bay Villa and realized that Nolan had come home earlier than her and had already prepared dinner for her. She put down her handbag, walked toward Nolan, hugged him from behind, and pressed her face against his back. Why have you come back so early? Nolan chuckled. I've, of course, come back to cook for my wife. He then turned around and hugged her. You went to find Maisie Hannigan today. Yeah. Maisie looked at him. She submitted and confessed. And I've handed her to the police. Nolan pinched her jaw. Aren't you afraid that she'll come at you for revenge when she gets out? Maisie raised her eyebrows. I've survived Willow and Rowena, so why would I be afraid of Maisie Hannigan? Nolan froze slightly, held her in his arms, and hugged her tightly. Maisie felt his warm embrace and pointed her fingertips at his beating heart. Your birthday is 28 days away. He lowered his gaze and stared at the person in his arms. Why would you remember my birthday all of a sudden? You're welcome to guess. Nolan picked her up. Have you learned to riddle me? Maisie chuckled softly, and the black hair hanging in the middle of the air wrapped around his arm, making her look exceptionally seductive. It seems that, Nolan kissed her. I can only reserve the dinner for later. It was dark outside the window as Nolan sat by the bed and answered Quincy's call. Chapter 834. Tony flicked off the ash on the cigarette, and his eyes looked stern and murderous. You useless piece of shit. The man in black lowered his head. He crushed the cigarette butt into the ashtray. I can't wait any longer. Peter just died. Although this can block the distribution of the shipment, Yael Boucher knows it's me. If it weren't because I have his son with me, he would have made a move on me long ago. The man in black looked at him. Then let's just kill those two. Anyway, the Bouchers and the Chases won't know about it. Tony's expression looked ruthless. No, we have to keep Yael's son with us. As for Michael's daughter, just tell them to get rid of others. He sneered. We'll beat the dog before the lion. I shall do everything they think I don't have the balls to do. I'm not afraid of Michael even if his daughter is dead. Even if he were to go to Yael after that, Yael will be afraid of me and dare not act rashly. Yael won't help Michael out as long as he still cares about his son. The separation between the Chases and the Bouchers is what I want to see the most. A few men in black broke into the room, and Barbara and Helios were woken up by the sudden noise. The first thing that caught their attention in an instant was those guards rushing toward Barbara and dragging her away. Helios stood up. "What are you trying to do? What are we trying to do?" One of the men in black said with a vicious smirk, "I advise you not to meddle in our business. Mr. Grant wants you to live, so all you need to do is wait for your father to save you." Seeing that they were about to take Barbara away, Helios grabbed onto her and said, "Let go of her." "Douchebag, are you looking for a beating?" A man in black raised his fist and was about to punch Helios. But Helios dodged it, grabbed his wrist, and kicked him in the abdomen. The man in black fell to the ground. The other men pushed Barbara aside and attacked Helios together. Barbara was so frightened that her face paled. Helios fought with them, but how could he withstand those thugs? He was soon overwhelmed by the men. Seeing those bodyguards laying their fingers and going all out on Helios, Barbara yelled, "Stop hitting him." She ran straight over and tackled one of the men who was about to lift his foot but got slapped by another man and fell to the floor. As Helios helped her up, he noticed blood oozing out of the corner of her lips and glared at those people gloomily. "You presumptuous mongrels! You dare to fight back while on our territory?" The man spat a mouthful of blood on the ground and waved at the other men in black. "Take this bitch away." Helios' eyes looked cold as he dragged her behind him. "Don't you dare touch her. Brat, are you trying to save the damsel in distress? It's a pity that it's already too late. I advise you to cherish your life." As for this woman, the man in black rubbed his chin as if he had thought of something and meted. "She's going to die, anyway. Let us enjoy her to the fullest before she dies. After all, we've never gotten our hands on any of those socialites yet." Barbara was stunned and froze in place. Her pupils dilated and constricted slightly, and she could not help but tremble. The two bodyguards held Helios down while he tried his best to resist as he witnessed Barbara being dragged away. He growled, "Let her go." He broke free from the bodyguards. But one of them grabbed him in a neck lock from behind. He immediately turned the opponent's arm around and flung him to the floor. Several other men rushed up to hold him down. He got up again but got punched in the abdomen. Helios crawled on the floor in a daze. And one of the men stomped on his back and got the others to work together to subdue him on the ground. Helios dashed. Barbara screamed hysterically as the man behind her grabbed her by her hair, pushed her down in an instant, and ripped her clothes apart. Chapter 8:35. Barbara yelled and swung her arms around frantically. The man raised his hand, slapped her twice, and cursed, "You fucking bitch. Do you want to end up like him?" 2 to 3 men stepped forward and pressed her against the floor, and Barbara was trapped under them. Crying in despair. The veins on the back of Helios' clenched fist bulged, and he exhausted all his remaining strength to break free of his captors and rush toward those 3 men. He knocked down those men. But before he could adjust his posture and regain balance, he was immediately punched in the cheek by the opponent. However, as he was falling to the floor, he propped his hands on Barbara's sides and covered her with his body. Even though he was being hit on the back multiple times, he would not budge in order to protect her. "You're quite a tenacious and stubborn one, aren't you? Do you still want to play the hero?" Several men kicked him vigorously and repetitively. Helios took the beating without making any noise, but the bruises on his face became clearly visible as the blood drained from his cheeks. And blood could be seen overflowing from the corners of his lips. Barbara's pupils constricted, and her heart trembled each time she saw the blows land on his back. Tears rolled from the corners of her eyes as she shook her head and squeezed a few words out of her throat. "Just let them have me. I can't just ignore you and leave you to them," Helios said while gritting his teeth. The blue veins on his forehead could be seen clearly, and he struggled to stay above her until the last moment when a sudden and heavy blow made him fall onto Barbara. Barbara saw a man lift a bat and pushed Helios away with every fiber of her being, while the bat hit her back, causing her to groan in pain. Helios gradually lost consciousness. The last scene that he remembered was Barbara blocking a bat for him. Several bodyguards pulled Barbara away from Helios. At that moment, Helios was still grasping her hand tightly. His voice was weak, but it sounded fierce. "Don't you dare touch her." The man was about to hit Helios when Barbara grabbed the hem of his trousers and begged as tears gushed out of the corners of her eyes. "Don't hit him, I beg you. I'll go with you." The man grabbed her by her long hair, picked her up, forced her to look up, and clicked his tongue. "Those who don't know might even think that you two are a couple. Wouldn't everything turn out better if the two of you were to let us have it our way?" Barbara shuddered. She stared at Helios with her profound gaze. He was lying on the floor, unable to move. She then glanced at the hand that was still holding on to her, and a tear rolled down her cheek. "How can someone like me be worthy of someone sacrificing their life in order to save mine?" "Helios Boucher, thank you," she murmured with a smile, broke free from his grasp, got up, and left with those men. "No." Helios raised his hand slowly but lost consciousness before he could finish the sentence. In another warehouse, several men were waiting excitedly outside a door. An older man who came at this moment looked at them. "What are you still doing here?" "Mr. Grant asked me to come and check with you guys." "Have you dealt with that woman?" One of the men stepped forward. "Mr. Sanchez, don't worry, leave it to us. We're already dealing with her." Leonard took a glance at the closed warehouse and frowned, but did not want to go into the details. "I don't care about what you're planning to do. All I'll ask is that you be more cautious when dealing with the woman and find a place to bury the body." The man nodded repetitively. "Yes, sir. Of course, sir." After Leonard left, the men waiting outside the door got a little impatient. "Why is that shit sack taking so long? How long do we have to wait?" "Yeah, I don't remember seeing him last this long. Did he take any pills before going inside?" One of the men placed his ear against the door and realized something strange. "No. I don't hear shit inside." All those men broke into the room, only to be shocked to find that the two of them had disappeared. A secret door that was blocked by random items lying around in the room led to an exit on the outside. The man in black brought Barbara along, and they were walking in a dark and narrow passage, lighting their way with a flashlight. Chapter 8:36. Barbara followed. "Who are you? Why did you save me?" The man in black answered, "Mr. Summer sent me to stay close to Mr. Grant. He was the one who asked me to save you. He was an undercover agent tasked to stay close to Tony Grant. Tony had sent a few of them to get rid of Barbara, but they had other plans. He was trying hard to play along so that they didn't suspect anything. He was the one who had suggested bringing Barbara to the warehouse because there was a hidden passage there." "Who is Mr. Summer?" She didn't know a Mr. Summer. "You don't need to know that just yet. We need to get out of here." Barbara held him back. "But they still have Helios." "Miss Chase, Mr. Grant isn't going to do anything to Mr. Boucher. He was planning to make you an example." The man pulled her by the wrist and looked serious. "They'll realize you're gone if we don't leave." The two of them walked through the hidden passage, but soon after they got out, a few cars immediately blocked the end of the alley they were in. Tony got out of the car with a few men. The man in black's expression changed, and he stood in front of Barbara to protect her. "Mr. Grant." Tony scoffed. "Good job, Leon. You've been working for me for so many years. How could you betray me?" Leon gnashed his teeth but didn't say anything. "I don't care who you're working for, neither of you is getting away today." Tony took a cigarette out of the packet, put it to his lips, and lit it with a lighter. The flame danced, and after the smoke cleared, Tony's fierce eyes flashed. "Grab them." The few men rushed forward while Leon pushed Barbara aside. He took out a dagger attached to his belt and started fighting them. Barbara backed up while trembling, but there was a wall behind her. There was no way out. The few men fought well. So Leon was quickly subdued and tackled to the ground. One of the men grabbed him by the hair and made him look up at Tony. Tony walked over with the cigarette between his lips and stood in front of him. "I've been good to you, Leon. Since you've been working for me for so long. I'll give you a chance. Tell me, who are you working for?" Leon didn't make a sound. Tony laughed dryly. "Such a good dog. That's why I didn't manage to train you even after so many years." He pressed the cigarette against Leon's forehead. At that moment, Leon groaned loudly while he bit down, the veins in his neck popping and all his muscles trembling. A bloody hole appeared on his forehead, and there was the smell of burnt flesh. His flesh was bloody. Tony tossed the cigarette butt away and signaled at them to let him go. Leon collapsed to the ground, with no energy left. Tony pushed his chin up with the tip of his shoe and looked down at him. "Leon, I respect that you're a good man, but you can't blame me if you choose not to talk." He got the men to bring Barbara over. 2 men grabbed her, dragged her in front of Tony, and shoved her. She lost her balance and fell next to his feet. Leon and Barbara's hands were tied up as they were brought into the woods with guns pointed at their heads. They were dragged to 2 freshly dug graves. Barbara trembled when she looked back at Tony, who was approaching. "Aren't you afraid that people will find out about this?" He laughed. "Of course, so, only dead men tell no tales." Barbara's face turned pale as a sheet. She knew that they weren't going to escape. But she wasn't willing to just die. Chapter 837. The gun was pointed at Barbara's head. She held her breath, and her blood froze while she closed her eyes tight. Tony was going to give the order when Leon said, "Kill me first." Tony looked at him. "Haha, do you think you're going to buy her sometime? You'll go together. Do it." 2 bodyguards cocked their guns and pointed them at the same time. "Mr. Grant." Mr. Sanchez's voice came from not too far away. Then he appeared, running. "Don't shoot." Leon took the chance when the people were distracted and tackled them. The sound of a gunshot echoed through the woods. Barbara saw Leon getting shot and collapsing to the ground, and her throat started drying up. Tony immediately looked back and noticed Mr. Sanchez had turned pale. "No," Tony reacted quickly and yelled. "Run!" The police followed the sound of the gunshot and surrounded them when a few men in black covered Tony so he could escape. "Save the hostage!" One of the officers noticed Barbara and rushed toward her. Barbara was untied. She looked at Leon, who had been shot in front of her, fell to her knees, and cried her heart out. A policewoman helped her up and consoled her. On the other side, Yael got out of the car, and when he saw Helios carried out of the house, he rushed forward. "Helios!" Helios slowly opened his eyes, and in a daze. He could see his father looking worried. "Dad. Save her." Yael knew what he meant. He held onto Helios' hand, trembling as though he had aged a decade. "Don't worry, you'll be fine. We're here to save you. Hang in there." Helios lost consciousness. A few days later, the police sent out a warrant for Tony Grant's arrest. Yael submitted evidence that showed Tony Grant's smuggling and murder cases, and the higher-ups ordered them to run a thorough investigation and take in all of Tony's men. Michael Chase and Yael Boucher's opponent, Joseph Chambers, transferred millions of dollars into an offshore account to avoid being linked to Tony Grant and Peter Zhivkov. Unfortunately, Yael held too much evidence, so he tore Joseph apart, which caused him to be removed from his position and sent to jail for investigation. A gust of wind passed through the blue jacaranda trees in the hospital's garden and caused a rain of blue petals, forming a natural carpet of flowers, beautiful and serene. Barbara sat on her bed and looked out at the bright blue color, her thoughts far away. Maisie stood outside her room with a bouquet of flowers, then knocked. Barbara looked back at her, and her voice sounded coarse. "You're here." Maisie put the flowers into a vase and stood next to the bed. "How are you feeling?" Barbara smiled and looked down. "All right." Maisie sat down and put her hand on Barbara's. "I'm glad you're both fine." Barbara's eyes moved, all the danger and adrenaline still fresh in her mind. "Yes, I almost died." Something came to her mind. How's Helios? She remembered that he was hurt worse than her. And it was because of her, so she felt guilty. Maisie smiled. "He's fine. Nothing serious, they're all just flesh wounds." Barbara was silent. Maisie stood up slowly. "You can go visit him if you're worried." Barbara walked to the next room with Maisie and stood outside. Nolan and the Bouchers were there. Chapter 838. Nolan walked out of the room and noticed them. "Why don't you go in?" Maisie held his arm. "We're just coming to take a look." Helios noticed them. Yael looked toward the door and said to Christina, "Let's go home and let Helios rest." Christina nodded. They walked out of the room, and Yael looked at Barbara. "I've spoken to your father about your situation. Don't worry." Barbara was surprised but nodded, "Thank you." After they left, Maisie nudged Barbara, "Go in." Barbara thought that she should thank Helios, so she walked into the room. Maisie gently closed the door, and Nolan looked at her and smiled. "What are you up to?" Maisie looked at him and lowered her voice. "Nothing, I just want them to have a talk." He chuckled. "Are you sure you're not trying to get them closer?" Maisie opened her mouth, but didn't speak. Barbara and Helios had been kidnapped together, and he had tried to save them while sacrificing his own safety. It wouldn't be too bad if they became a couple. Nolan knew what was in her mind, so he pointed his finger to her forehead. "Why don't you start a matchmaking company?" Maisie raised her eyebrow. "Is Mr. Goldman going to be an investor?" He laughed, saw the chance and took it. "Huh?" Maisie played with his tie, her eyes twinkling. "Yes. Because Mr. Goldman loves me so much." Nolan hugged her and whispered into her ear, "All right, I'll love you more when we're home." In the room, Helios looked at Barbara, who was silent. "Are you all right?" She paused and looked around. "I'm fine." Then she looked at Helios' bruised face. "I'm sorry for getting you involved in this. You could have just left me." Helios looked down, looking guilty. "No, I'm the one who should be apologizing." She was surprised. "You saved me in the end." "While I..." Helios' breathing became heavy, his face tense. "Could only watch while you were taken away." Barbara was about to say something when he looked up at her. "All this was because of me. I'll take responsibility." Her mind was blank for a few seconds. "You..." Helios looked resolute. "I don't care about that and will not push you away. I know that you're a victim." Barbara slowly reacted, her lips slightly parted. "Are you pitying me?" Helios paused. Barbara smiled. "You don't need to offer yourself to me, because you feel guilty. They weren't going to let me off easily whether you were there or not." Helios frowned and stared at the woman before him. He did pity her, but his heart also ached for her. Barbara was afraid that he would regret it, so she explained. "They took me away but didn't do anything to me because someone saved me." Helios was surprised. She adjusted her gown and looked at him calmly. "You are a great person. But you can't take responsibility every time this happens to someone." 2 days later, Riley and Maisie came to help Barbara with her discharge procedures. When they were getting the paperwork done, they bumped into Helios, who was getting discharged too. Helios had a mask and cap on. And Nina, his assistant, was with him. It was evident that the Bouchers didn't know about his discharge. Chapter 839. Helios, Riley walked toward him. "You're getting discharged too?" Helios paused, turned to look at Barbara and Maisie, then turned around again. I wasn't too badly hurt, and I have work to finish. Maisie looked at Barbara, who was quiet, bowed, and nudged her with her shoulder. What's wrong? Barbara was curious. What do you mean? Aren't you going to say hi? Maisie squinted. Why did they become distant after being in the hospital together? Barbara's eyes moved around. She had never gone to see Helios again after that day. She appreciated Helios' attempt at saving her while disregarding his own safety. She was definitely moved. If someone had protected her when the incident with Eric happened, she might just have married that person. But after what Helios had said, she didn't know how to face him. The man was willing to sacrifice himself to save her and wanted to take responsibility because he thought she had been assaulted because of him. All that did touch her heart. However, all that wasn't love. It was just spending time together so that there was less guilt. Barbara composed her emotions, raised her head, and smiled. We see each other every day. There's no need to greet him. Maisie crossed her arms. Is that true? After Riley was done with the paperwork, she walked toward them and handed the medical records to Barbara. We're done. Thanks. Barbara put the records away and placed her arm on her shoulder. I need to go home now. I'll buy dinner one day. Barbara left before them. Riley watched her walk away and elbowed Maisie's arm. Z, don't you think Barbara and my cousin would make a great couple? Maisie looked at her. What do you think? She smiled. I think so. They're a good match. Maisie hugged her shoulder and sighed. But we can't force them together. Riley understood and sighed too. My cousin isn't exactly young anymore. My aunt and uncle are getting anxious. Maisie took her arm back and chuckled. It's all up to fate. When Maisie got back to Seoul, Sadai walked toward her. Ma'am. Maisie Hannigan has been released. Maisie stopped in her tracks and turned to look at her. Released? Sadai nodded. She convinced the police that she could help them arrest Tony Grant and provided some evidence. She was sincere and is pregnant. So the police decided to give her a chance. Maisie squinted. Maisie was really pregnant? She thought she was lying. Sadai suddenly asked, by the way, don't you plan to tell Ms. Chase about what you promised Ian Summer? Maisie smiled. After tonight. Maisie got home and sent a message to her godfather, Tony Grant, after taking a shower. If she could trick him into showing up, she could get a break from the police. She knew that Tony had another number, and very few people other than her knew about it. Unsurprisingly, Tony replied to her. Since he didn't know that the police had arrested her, he didn't suspect a thing. She then called Officer Zaleski. Tony Grant has replied to my message. What should I do next? Officer Zaleski said something. And Maisie fully cooperated and even offered to get tickets for a ship at 2 p.m. the next day to help him escape with her own name. Chapter 840. Maisie sent the message to Officer Zaleski and happily looked at her phone screen. Do you think you can send me to jail just by providing some voice recording, Maisie? Huh, didn't she get out in the end? She was going to remember this. That night, Barbara went to see the manager and the owner of the Glitz Club but was told that neither of them was there. She left the club but it suddenly started pouring. It was a cold, rainy night, and she stood under the roof outside, staring at the cars passing by on the streets. The red and green lights stood lonely in the rain, and the light was reflected in the puddles on the floor. A black car parked not far away with the back window rolled halfway down. A bespectacled man was hidden in the shadows. The driver looked at him. Sir? Isn't that Miss Chase? Ian looked back. Call someone to hand her an umbrella, but don't say it's from me. Barbara wanted to leave when the rain stopped, but a server walked over to her with a black umbrella in hand. Ms. Chase. She turned around, and the server handed the umbrella to her. "The rain is pouring, you can have this." Barbara was stunned, but he had already put the umbrella in her hand. He turned around, and she called out to him, "How did you know that I was standing outside?" The server couldn't tell her that his boss had told him to do that, so instead, he said, "Since you just walked out and I heard the rain started, I thought you wouldn't have gone far, so I came out to take a look." Barbara fell silent. After the server went back in, she looked at the black umbrella in her hand and felt that it was too much of a coincidence. She stepped into the rain with the umbrella, and when she walked past the black car, the person in the car looked down and sent a message, then blocked that number. He then looked up, "Drive." The car drove away from the person walking behind, moving further and further away. Barbara stopped in her tracks, took out her phone, and saw a message. She stared at it for a long time before she suddenly ran back. The server was making a drink behind the bar when he saw her rush in. "Where's your boss?" He was stunned upon seeing her face and sleeves wet with rainwater. "Miss Chase, why?" She immediately repeated, "I asked you, where's your boss?" The server didn't want to argue, so he said, "He sold the club to a woman a few days ago and said he would leave the country. He got the manager to get the paperwork done and never returned." Barbara was a little out of it, and her throat felt dry. "What is your boss name?" The server scratched his head. "Honestly, I don't know his real name. But we know that his surname is Summer from Asperia." "Summer? Could it be?" Barbara read the message again and tried to recall everything she knew, including how Katrina had tried to frame her. So was it really him? Ian Summer. A few servers suddenly looked toward the door when a woman walked in with 4 bodyguards. She had her jacket on her arm. The few servers smiled and looked at her. "Welcome, ma'am." Barbara looked at Maisie, who was approaching. Her face, which was still dripping with rainwater, looked shocked. "You're the new owner of the club?"